Hello, lovely beings. I'm JJ Rose. Today, I have two special friends with me to talk to you about some fun weirdness while we read the Mothman Prophecies and the Eighth Tower. I've got Emily.
Hi, guys.
And I've got Sheila.
Hello.
All right. So, we three decided to go down Mr. Toad's Wild Road and record this episode today in regards to reading the Mothman Prophecies and subsequently the Eighth Tower, both by the author John Keel. And it's kind of interesting. These books were read, they were written, sorry, not read, written in 1975. So it's been a while. They've been out for some time. I've heard about them over probably the last 4 or 5 years. Hellier really brought them kind of into my world, if you will. But I never wanted to read them. And the reason why I never wanted to read them is because I knew when you read this book, Mothman Prophecies specifically, that weirdness would start. And I tripled down on this. So when I decided I wanted to read it, I had told Emily about this, as Sheila as well, and a couple other people, and they were like, "Where are you getting that from?" And I was like, "Well, everyone knows that." And I just thought it was common knowledge, but apparently it was not, to the point that Miss Emily over there decided to go online and Google it, thinking maybe it was just something she hadn't heard of. And indeed, apparently no one else has heard of that. But maybe it was just my premonition knowing weirdness was about to occur. So that being said, I want to introduce why and how we ended up with the two books. So originally we were just going to do the Mothman Prophecies, and I decided I was going to read it. Told Emily, she was like, "Great, I'll order it with you." And when I went to order it, the second book came up, The Eighth Tower, and it was something compelled me to order it. It wasn't my normal, okay, I just want to dig into two books. It was the same way, Emily, I think you had it as well. It was almost like a compulsion. We had to
Yeah.
read both.
Yeah, so for me, I saw the Eighth Tower in relation to Mothman Prophecies, and I was like, "Oh, that's the one that I want to read." And I didn't know why I felt the way. I didn't even know what it was about. Obviously, I knew what the Mothman Prophecies was about, but I didn't know what the Eighth Tower was about. And the fact that I felt that way, and then you mentioned, "Oh, I also want to get this one," and I was like, "Me too," and then we agreed to do it.
And the even weirder thing is, we kept having these weird synchronicities start with the number 9, which is a big number in my life, but it came up for both of us. We bought the book on different days, but yet both of our delivery dates were the 9th. And Emily, you actually got yours on the 9th. I did not, because for whatever weird reason, my mailman decided to deliver it to the side of my house under a bush. And I'm laughing hysterically at this because this has never ever happened in all the years that I've lived here. Thankfully, when Amazon delivers, they send you a little snapshot. So I had to go find what bush it was under, which was very weird. And it took, I think, what was that, Emily? A day or two it took me?
Yeah, I think it took you a full day. You're like, "Oh, well, it says it's delivered, but I don't know where." So I think it took you a day to find it.
Yeah. So we start reading it. And originally, Sheila, we had told you probably not, probably don't read it right now. Um, just because I didn't want you exposed to too much weirdness.
Yeah.
But then one day you were like, "Nope, I've already downloaded it." And then you read the entire thing in a day, which still amazes me to this day. But all of us kind of read the first book really, really fast.
Hmm.
It was almost like a compulsion to read the first book really, really fast. And it is a really good book, don't get me wrong. But there was one point where we stopped reading it, and we have lives, right? And Emily, you had a story where the book screamed at you, basically.
Yep. Yeah. So I actually put it down for a full day. I was like, I have to focus on housework and I have other things that I need to get done. So I put it down and I put it underneath my nightstand on the side of my bed. I also had like a bag of crystals kind of just chilling right there because I had just dug that out of storage. And so they were just both there under my beds, where my kids couldn't get into them and you know, rip out pages of the book or anything like that. And I was sitting on my bed and I hear like a tinkling sound and I knew it was my crystals. I just knew. And I went and I looked and there was crystals that were falling out of the bag, and the way that I had the book, I had it like kind of like leaned up against the bag, um, on like, more towards the wall, and the book was on the complete opposite side, facing a different direction than the way that I had put it. And it was like, upside down versus where I had it before, where it was right side up. So something literally pulled the book and moved it. And when they did that, it got my attention only because I heard the sound of the crystals. If I didn't hear the crystals, I wouldn't have heard the book moving because it was underneath my nightstand. And I was just like, whoa, that's really strange, because I had to kind of force myself to put the book down and focus on life for a while. And the fact that the second I decided to do that, my book moves on its own. And it's like, no, you need to read me. And I was just like, oh, well, that's awkward.
And what was strange for me is, normally I'm pretty busy, so sitting down and reading for hours, although I love it, is not something I normally get the luxury of doing. And so I kind of knew this is going to be a process over, at least 2 weeks, right? And all these things kept canceling, like delay, delay, delay. And so I ended up having all this time to read, which is very weird. Again, it was almost like the books were screaming for attention. Sheila, if you want to share what your compulsion was, honey, to read an entire book in 20 hours, that was amazing.
Yeah, no, because I remember you were surprised that I had never seen Hellier. And so what I had done was like binge watched Hellier, I think, in a matter of a couple of days. And then they kept bringing up the book. And so then I was like, well, and you guys were talking about all the weird stuff that happened. Because at this point, I think you two had already finished the books. And we're working on the second one.
I think we were close to finishing.
Or close to finishing or something. But I know I hadn't started it when you guys were like, that point where you stopped in the second book. And then I caught up. But, yeah, so like I immediately downloaded it the second I finished Hellier. Because I was like, well, what the heck was all that? So then I'm like, well, now I gotta read Mothman. So I told you, I was like, well, I already downloaded it to my Kindle. I'm gonna read it right now. And then I read like more than half of it, I think. So I'd gotten halfway through the book and then I stopped to sleep. And then I think I woke up the next day and then just continued reading, after I was taking care of my son and everything. And then I was just like, I'm just going to keep reading. And then I finished it by evening, I think.
Yeah, I was almost concerned you were not going to get the full force of the book because you read it so fast. But, awesome. I love it. What was really interesting to me is we all kind of like powered through book 1 super fast. And we get on book 2, which is the Eighth Tower, and it's extremely fascinating. Originally, the Eighth Tower was going to be in the book The Mothman Prophecies, but the editor was like, yeah, this is too long and, you need to separate this out. So they decided to. What was fascinating to me is all three of us hit major delays when it came to the second book. Like, we were on fire for the first. Second book, it was like every distraction that could happened. And then when we were reading it, we were even telling each other how we felt like we were falling asleep. Normally you put me in front of a book and sit me down, I'll read until there's, till someone makes me get up. And I kept falling asleep, which is very odd for me. Both of you were falling asleep. Sheila, you even said it felt like someone slipped you a Benadryl at one point.
Yeah, that's exactly what it felt like. I was just like, right when that Benadryl kicks in and you want to fall asleep, that's what it was feeling like every time I would sit there and read it for more than 10 minutes at a time.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about the second book is it's not as experience heavy as the first book. It's a lot more technical. And I mean, to be honest, I learned a ton about myself and people like us from it, just from a science perspective, which is totally my jam. But what I also found interesting is in the second book, it brings up, as well as in the first, a lot of people who have had spiritual encounters and or are doing spiritual work end up low in iron, magnesium, B vitamins, and minerals. And all of us ended up with the same.
Mm-hmm.
And then you two ended up having migraines when you were at the tail end of the book. Sheila, you somehow powered through and ended up getting a migraine. Like, you had a migraine within a day of each other. And
yeah,
you don't live in the same place.
I woke up with it the next morning because I woke up from a dead sleep with it. Like, I had that migraine over my left eye, and I actually, to the point where I had to throw up. And then I got up, did that, took some medicine, and went back to sleep. Like, it was rough.
Yeah, and Emily was out, like, the whole day before with hers.
Yeah. So mine lasted like 2.5, almost 3 days. And it was weird because it wasn't like my typical ones where I have extreme like light sensitivity and noise sensitivity. I had a little, but what I was having was mostly like physical pain, just due to like the tension and everything from the headache, like, you know, the migraine itself, like to the point that my spine, like the upper part of my spine was just in so much pain, and my neck hurt, and I just felt stiff, and like that was just miserable. Like, it's not like the worst that I've had, but it's different than how I normally have them.
Agreed. I actually ended up starting to lose my vision last night from one, but I caught it really quick, and I was like, not tonight. So
Looking at my dog now, Stevie's gonna grab
so there was this weird thing throughout the book that John Keel was experiencing, where he was having a lot of synchronicities, a lot of people come to him, to the point where he was getting almost paranoid because there were so many things that were happening and different entities speaking through different people and giving him similar messages that, you know, he was thinking it's either, he was getting paranoid, basically. Either thinking like this is a government orchestrated thing or someone's talking to somebody. But he did a couple things to ferret that out, and that was not the case. It really was these entities. Well, me, I ended up having basically just that. I don't know any other way to explain it. It got so out of hand. I know I was venting to both of you, and Sheila, you made the joke, is my name John Keel? It is not. But, I mean, it got to the point where I was even wondering, like, is someone messing with me? Like, has someone hacked my phone or, you know, gone into my email and they're deliberately doing this, like, to mess with me? But then it would come from these like, people I hadn't heard from in a very long time come out of the woodwork to tell me. I don't know why I was just really drawn to tell you about this dream that I had. And then it correlates to something that, like, someone had messaged me about the exact same experience. So these are two people who don't know each other, completely unrelated, over and over and over again. I had a situation with the red dragon regarding the veil. The 7 stones came up again. Sheila, there was actually a situation with you. You had a dream. And the very next day, I end up getting an email from someone who I've never talked to or heard from before, who basically says, you know, I have this memory from when I was a child, and describes this memory in vivid detail and was like, you know, can you tell me, did this really happen? Or, like, did I make this up in my head? And as I'm reading this email, I'm like, this is weird. Like, this is the dream Sheila had the day before. And the even weirder part was the dream you had the day before was from the perspective of watching this play out and you were a silent observer. Like, no one could tell you were there. So, of course, I end up telling the person, this is kind of strange. You know, someone had this weird dream the other day. And then that person got freaked out. So, sorry about that, by the way. Did not mean to freak you out. But, hey, it happened. Even more synchronicities that started to happen. Here was a really weird one, kind of at the beginning of the book. I was doing a meditation, just trying to, you know, this is very early on in the Mothman Prophecy book. I did a meditation. For whatever reason, I saw a giant spider on my ceiling. Not like giant, like, you know, Jurassic Park giant, but big enough daddy long legs that, like, it should have jarred me. And for whatever reason, I was, like, super chill about it. And I blinked my eyes, and I opened my eyes again, and I see there's no spider there. I'm like, okay, whatever, that might be important. But for me, something like that, it has to happen multiple times for me to really pay attention. Because, you know, if I go down something happening once to me, I will fly down far too many rabbit holes, and I don't have time for that. So within a week, I had a spider run past me in bed. Not on me, but like on the wall right next to me. I had one go in the actual bed. So I had to burn the bed and move. And then I had one in the car. Now, granted, is it spider season? Honestly, I don't know if they have a season. I don't want to know if there's a season for spiders. Terrifying to me. But that being said, you know, I took it as a sign. It came up multiple times, looked up spider medicine, and I realized Spirit was warning me I was in a web. Like, something else was spinning some wheels. There was one point when in our group chat, Sheila basically was saying, like, she didn't understand a part of the book that was being said and what they were talking about. It, like, the math wasn't mathing for her. And I was at the same part, and I clearly texted out, "You are not wrong." And "not" I did in all capital letters. And yet, when it sent, it just said, "You were wrong." And I mean, thankfully you have a great sense of humor, because I didn't even catch it. I just thought that I know what I texted. And then you were like, well, thanks. Like, I'm glad I'm not wrong. But so, you know, I felt awful when I actually read it back. But it was almost like it was changing what we were saying to each other. Emily, I know you and I had a couple things where it was changing words, and we were like, why would it autocorrect to that? Like, it made no sense.
Yep.
And in a way, I almost felt like it was like quietly, like being like, poke, poke, poke. Maybe not have you all on the same page or create a little drama, right? Luckily, we're hip, so we know what's going on. So then I find this extremely important video that I thought was corresponded to the books, corresponded to what we were talking about. And I sent it on the group chat, and I am dead serious about, like, I even send a message with it. This is important. I need you all to take 3.5 minutes and listen to this all the way through. Extremely important. Poor Sheila, once again, was like, I don't get it. So me not realizing, I'm like, what don't you get? Like, it's so apparent. It's so clear. And it was a video. I don't know if I can get through this without laughing, falling off my chair. It was literally a video about someone watching someone make this terrible macaroni dish and commenting on it. And so not only Sheila, but also Emily was like, well, I don't get it either. And I was like, what's wrong with both of you? And so then I scroll up and I see the video that's set. And I was like, how? I listened to that like an hour ago. That wasn't even on my browser. So that was, again, fun. And again, you know, creating confusion, right? So little pokes. Something that was kind of interesting, at one point I was so far down this rabbit hole of weird. Things in my life were extremely overwhelming. I was just so distracted, so busy. I had all these people coming out of the woodwork telling me all these weird things that were lining up with other people's stuff. It was just weird, right? So I get on the phone with Eric from Uncomfortable Podcast, and I'm like, hey, you're kind of my voice of reason. You're not necessarily into all this stuff. Can you do me a huge favor and just, like, remind me to ground or something? And so he listens a little, and he's like, okay. And I guess he had been watching a YouTube video on Star Wars. And as we're talking and as he's trying to, tell me, calm down, like, are you sure you're just not overhyping this because you're getting in your head about the book? Which, can happen, right? That's totally legit. On his YouTube, it literally just switches to an episode called Mothman Point Pleasant, and on the screen is a picture, all in black, of a silhouette of a man with this huge white smile. Like, super creep-tastic, right? So then he gets a little weirded out, and he was like, I gotta go. And I'm like, I don't blame you. So yeah, it affected everyone. So after all this weirdness, not even after, this is in the midst of all this weirdness, I have spirits showing up, directly in front of me, to the point where I'm like shooing them away. I had a little boy who literally just jumped up on my chest while I was sleeping. I had an older man wearing like a Hawaiian shirt, like screaming, almost like someone standing in a phone booth, yelling. Like it's muffled, but like you could still hear it with this urgency that I'm not used to. Normally spirits are pretty cool and chill, but this was a lot. And I know, Emily, you had a ton, because this is definitely more your stuff than mine.
Yeah. So, I mean, I too had a little boy. He was about, I don't know, like 7 or so. And I saw him run from my kitchen to, like, my dining table area and then just kind of, like, popped out. He, like, vanished. And then I was laying in bed, and there was this, like, bald old man that, like, crawled up from the floor up onto my bed and, like, got up in front of my face. And, he had this, like, big grinning smile. And so when you said that, the video popped up on Eric's thing of just a big smile. I was just like, oh, that's really creepy, because I too had a grinning man, and he was bald, and he was wearing like this like tan, like two-tone, like a tan and a brown like bowler shirt, and it was just freaking creepy. I was like, nope. I light blasted him off. I was like, go away. I'm not dealing with that.
Yeah. Sheila, did you have like more spiritual encounters than normal during this time that you can remember?
Not really. For me, it was more like it was messing with my emotions. I guess that would technically be a spiritual encounter.
Yeah.
But like, I just felt all over the place all the time, and I was just like, what the heck is going on? I'm like, yeah, I guess it could be hormones, but like, why did it stop when I stopped reading the books? Like, the timing was just very coincidental. So, yeah, like, I was feeling kind of down, honestly.
Yeah.
And I think there was like, because yeah, there was that time where you even thought I was still mad at you or something, because
of the mistaken text.
Yeah, like the next day, like I'd been really quiet because we normally, talk consistently on a daily basis, and I just hadn't been messaging anybody. Like, I was just in a really weird headspace that day, and you were like, "Are you okay? Are you still mad at me?" Like, I'm like, no, not at all. Like, I'm just feeling a little weird and off, and just trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, it was interesting how the second book almost gave me like an instant case of ADD, where it's like I just couldn't focus. Sheila, you definitely had some of that, and then the tiredness, and then the emotional roller coaster. I was definitely on an emotional roller coaster, but more so just because everything was so busy and so chaotic. Like, I literally had one day that I was from 7 a.m. until 2:30 in the morning, I was on the phone the entire day, or, messaging and emailing, like, one crisis after another. And these weren't just like everything in my life. Like, these were all having to do with the veil, people having these weird things they were seeing. It literally got to the point where I was like, what is happening? So now that you've heard all of the weird that we encountered, we're going to go a little bit over the books themselves into some parts that really stuck out to us. And it is kind of interesting, it's 2023. These were written in 1975. We have a lot of puzzle pieces that connect now more so than ever, I think. So, Sheila, you discovered the 1-2-3 pattern.
Oh, yeah. The 1-2-3 pattern. Yeah, it was interesting because I had noticed the 1-2-3 pattern in Hellier because I remember they made a comment about how I think it was Carl's favorite number or something in the show, and I was like, oh, I'm surprised I hadn't noticed that a lot of things kept coming up on, like, dates or times in the show that matched up with that, and then there was, like, also some dates in the book that lined up with that as well. And then I think when you guys or Emily, you were stuck on page 123 for the longest time.
I was,
in the second book.
Yeah, yep.
And so there was that kind of weird thing.
Well, and it was throughout the book. I mean, things would happen on, December 3rd or October 2nd, whatever. It did repeat, and, I put a whole bunch of tabs in the book where I found it once you pointed it out. The other thing that I thought was extremely interesting, and probably at the time they just thought it was weird, but in retrospect, it's very interesting. The sulfur smell associated with the sightings. Okay, we've heard that with cryptids, we've heard it with demons, heard it with, dark entities, things like that. But here's the really interesting thing. There were all these different stories about these weird people showing up to people's homes, offices, whatever. And they always had these thick-toed shoes. Thick-soled shoes. Wow, that is difficult to say. And they always looked odd. They definitely looked like someone pretending to be a human. And they would take these sulfur tablets. And they had to take them. And I thought that was interesting because if you think about if it is someone who's coming here and they're from another habitat or environment, planet, whatever it is, and they need sulfur in their diet in high levels in order to function properly, whether it is to breathe or just exist, isn't that fascinating that the sulfur smell seems to be associated with some of these cryptid sightings as well as, dark entity sightings? I just thought that was kind of interesting. Emily, you had weird phone calls, and those were definitely throughout the book, a whole bunch of weird phone calls.
Yeah, so it actually started right after I ordered the book. I went and recorded with Tommy Cullum from Let's Get Freaky, and then literally starting the following morning, I started getting all of these no caller ID, unknown calls, and I answered a couple of them, just in case they were spam. I didn't want to make it seem like I had an active phone line, but I would answer a couple of them, and I would say hello, and then it only lasted for about 3 seconds or so, and then it would hang up. And then if I answered it and didn't say anything, no feedback was given into the mic at all, same thing, about 3 seconds or so, and it would hang up. And it was happening, I was getting 6 or 7 a day for basically a week, and then it stopped for a week, and then it started up again. And it made me super paranoid. I'm like, why am I getting all these phone calls? I'm not used to getting calls like this. I never get, spam calls, and if this is spam, why am I getting it? It's kind of weird, the timing of everything. I just recorded a podcast episode with Tommy. I just ordered the Mothman book. And actually, now that I think about it, I think it started right when I ordered it, and then right when I got the book is when it started up again. If I'm like thinking about the timeline, because it was about a week of a difference where I had nothing. Um, so that's kind of interesting to think about.
Well, and what was also interesting is the recording you did with Tommy was on your experiences with UFOs.
That is true. Yeah, I did include that. And I didn't even mention anything about us, reading the Mothman. I didn't even know the Mothman book, honestly, was so heavily, like, UFO, like, influence. I thought it was going to be mostly about the Mothman sightings and all of that, and that was, like, maybe 5% of the book total.
Maybe even less than that, to be honest, because the Mothman's in there, like, what, 3, 4 times, and then the whole rest of it is I mean, I have to say, from my perspective, I've been listening to these stories and encounters and stuff most of my life. So, all the big ones I pretty much already know about. 75% of what was in this book I have never heard before. And, the short man who came in with the thick soled shoes and got super excited about a pen and giggled and ran off.
Yeah, like he hung around and then he asked if he could have the pen, and they were like, yeah, okay, that's fine. And he laughed, like, really excited, and ran off. And, like, that's super strange. Well, and what I also found weird was just kind of, like, the way that you described them. And I made this connection the other day. They kept, Keel kept using the term, like, Oriental. Like, they look like they're from the Orient, which would be, they would be,
Asia.
like, Chinese, Japanese, Asia. Yeah, Asians, essentially, right? And if you think about the world's population, that is the highest concentration of people. So if they are trying to blend in with humanity, they're going to choose something that resembles most like the highest population on Earth, because in book 2, that's kind of what he talked about. Oh yeah, like, he kind of alludes them to being like the Men in Black, but then he says, like, these strange people they visit people all over after they've had UFO encounters. And so, I mean, if it's going to be a worldwide thing, yeah, they're going to choose, the race that best aligns with the most population, on the planet.
It does, but if I probably remember 1975 better than you two. That being said, in 1975, it was not as widely known about some people from Asian countries having deeply tanned skin. So back in those days, the perception was very kind of geisha-like, especially, you got to remember, this is an older book, okay? So when he uses the term Oriental, we don't use that today, but typically that would have meant Chinese, Japanese to that time frame in which he's explaining this. Back then, whenever you would see in movies or, any depiction especially in America, of someone Chinese or Japanese, they always had the very pale white skin. So the fact that all of these entities, deities, people, whatever they were, showed up, almost all of them across the board said they were all deeply tanned. And yet they looked Oriental, which was interesting. So I know it's just a weird little sticking point, but for me it struck me odd. Even to call that out. But even, the way that all of them show up with these super thick-soled boots, like, not normal, like super thick. Okay, well, what would be the purpose of having super thick-soled rubber shoes? Like, the old joke was, oh, wear those in case you're going to get electrocuted, right?
Right, yeah.
So, okay, so there's this other thing that kept coming up as well, and it was this whoosh sound. And Sheila, you kept hearing this whoosh sound.
Well, it was funny because when I mentioned it, I didn't even know that it was, like, a phenomenon related to it at the time. Like, the first time that it happened, and then it happened again, and I'm like, oh, this is creepy. Yeah, I was making a phone call, and during, like, the ringtone, calling into where I was calling, I kept hearing this really weird whoosh sound, and it sounded like I've never heard it in my life. Like, I've never heard this sound making a phone call ever. I've heard, like, the weird clicky sounds that sometimes you hear. Shout out to whatever NSA agents listening in. I'm just kidding. But, and I've, like, heard other, like, weird, fax machine dial tone, like, all that. Like, I've heard that before, but I've never heard this weird whoosh. And it sounded so alien, I guess, in a way, because, like, it was weird. I just remember I felt uncomfortable when I heard it, and it freaked me out the first time. And then it stopped, and I, like, had to leave a message for somebody, and then it stopped once, like, the message, like, answered, and I left my message, and then it was, like, a week or two later, I made another phone call, and it happened again. And it's funny, because I've made other phone calls since, like, calling family, and never heard that sound.
And what was interesting is you heard that prior to even reading the book.
Yeah.
Like, right before.
The first time was prior, yeah, because I remember I was watching Hellier, and I think it was actually at one point, and it took, like, I recorded a little clip of Hellier, because I'm like, it kind of sounded like this sound in Hellier. It's kind of what it sounded like, I said, but you could barely hear it in the recording that I took. Yeah, it was super weird, and it made me uncomfortable, and I didn't like it.
So, earlier on when I was talking about when Sheila, you joked with me, like, oh, is your name John Keel? The reason why that even got brought up is because, like Keel, I am a central person that a lot of people come to with their weird. Besides my YouTube channel and whatever I do publicly, obviously, I know people as well. And for a lot of those people, I kind of am a confidant for them because they know I understand this stuff and it's someone safe that they can talk to. And because I do just know so many people in general, but it was fascinating to me the sheer amount of people in 3 weeks that were coming to me. And some of them, like I said, I haven't talked to in a very long time. So for them to just show up out of the blue and at that specific time when all this was happening and be like, hey, this happened, I really want to tell you about it. I just found it weird. Did I read a whole lot into it at the time? It was getting a little overwhelming, so yes. But, of course, being done with book 2, all the weirdness stopped. Thank you, God. One interesting thing that I hit on for the Mothman Prophecies is the majority of the time, all of the entities were extremely helpful, not only to Keel, but to other people, until right before the bridge collapsed. And all of a sudden, and it's like this one sentence that you two even missed. And we're like, wait a minute, what? I got to go back and read that. It's almost one sentence where he says it was within a week that all the entities suddenly just flipped the script and kind of became mean or disappeared right before the bridge collapsed. I found that odd. But
yeah, I agree because, well, what was interesting is it seems like the entities, they were kind of interfering and intermingling people without them knowing, like people that don't know each other. But Keel would get all this information and he was connecting kind of like the pieces as it went along. And then he kind of noticed, yeah, like now they're playing tricks. Now they're starting to leave threats. Now, now they're just, the entities are behaving in a way that they weren't prior. And, that was interesting. And for what? I don't know. But, and then once the bridge collapsed, they just weren't around anymore.
Yeah, everything stopped.
Yep.
Well, according to him, because, I don't know, he really didn't go on much further after that.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
It might have weirded him out. One thing that was interesting, and I'm bringing it up as we go into the second book, was the eye. Now, obviously, I talk with you, my last YouTube, which was last month, regarding the veil and the eye at the end, in which I talked about numerous people, reporting to me they'd either seen this weird eye or had it appear in a dream. I really didn't know what to do with all that information other than I had painted the thing months before. I thought that was weird, right? So in this book that I am not expecting whatsoever, the eye, all these people had this weird experience with this eye-like thing. I mean, I have seven different notations of people having experiences in which they shared there was a giant eye looking at them, or they were on a bed and this big eye thing was over them, etc. So I just wanted to throw that in because I found that to be a really weird correlation. It was something I've never heard of before, especially with these books. I was not expecting it. And when it popped up, I remember, Emily, immediately you and I were sending it to each other like, what?
Mm-hmm.
So we started keeping tabs on them. So then we get into book 2, where all of a sudden we went from super all three of us being able to focus to completely all three of us having ADD or becoming super tired and narcoleptic whenever we would read, and trying to figure it all out. Okay, so Emily spots this part where it talks about solar activity spits electrons through space and they cluster with iron fillings. And the interesting thing about that, and this is going to get a little TMI, I'm just warning you all, okay? All of us are slightly anemic, meaning we're low in iron. Okay, that's fine. We're all women and we're still of childbearing ages. You can figure that rest out on your own why I'm saying that. The other interesting thing is all of us cycled during this time of reading these books, which obviously reduces our iron even more. And one thing that Keel brings up in both books is most of the encounters that females were having, they were having them when they were menstruating. And of course, naturally, any female, even if you're okay in iron, your iron automatically diminishes when it's that time because you're losing blood. I did find that interesting. And then in the second book where he's talking about, these electrons being spit out from solar activity, which is solar flares, etc., clustering with iron fillings. And I'm wondering almost, is the lack of iron in our bodies somehow like a defense mechanism against all these electrons compiling, since they seem to bond with the iron?
Well, and that's like, you bring up a good point because, okay, so at the beginning of reading The Eighth Tower, I had this, like, vision that kind of came through. I just got to bed. I wasn't tired yet. Essentially, it was, like, the whole background was kind of like this milky white, but, like, you could see depth to it, right? And there was all these, like, little individual pieces. And at first, I thought, like, okay, maybe they're, like, water droplets or something. They're kind of like this bluish, grayish color. But then they all begin shooting up to a central point in the sky. And I'm, like, standing from a below view. And as they are kind of pulling up, they looked like iron filings, like being drawn up to a magnet. Like, the way that they were kind of jagged and, like, they were following along, like, a magnetic field. And once they reach the central point, it explodes into an eye. And with the eye in the sky and the solar activity and the iron filings.
I'm sorry. I'm shaking my head at Emily right now. That's why she's laughing.
Well, and I didn't at peace, like, because I was like, I even told the girls, like, when it happened, I was like, yes, I had this super weird vision last night. I don't know what it means yet. Because, like, to me, it was like, it almost felt like a rapture of sort, but, like, not like that, right? It was like just seeing all everything kind of gathering in one central place. If iron is being taken, and put up there, like, maybe that's what it was. And maybe it has to do with this eye phenomena. Who knows? Like,
well, speaking of the eye, I'm actually going to read an excerpt from the Eighth Tower. It's just one paragraph. And here's what it says, and the importance of why I'm reading this. In occult lore, eyes, or a single huge eye, play a very important role. The eye is an ancient symbol for the deity. Persons suffering from paranoid schizophrenia see eyes everywhere. They turn on a water faucet and a huge eye oozes out. First of all, ew, sorry. In Egyptology, the Eye of Horus is one of the most important symbols. It represents all sorts of mathematical equations. On every dollar bill atop the pyramid, on the obverse side of the Great Seal of the USA, there is the same great eye. On my field trips, I am always alert for two phenomena: witnesses who see sudden flashes of light, like a flash gun going off, and people who have seen some sort of eye during their experience. The visions of eyes cannot be rationally explained, but they are significant. So I read that in the book. I highlight the whole paragraph, and I'm just sitting here going, great. So whenever me seeing this eye and having all this eye stuff, you know, a month before we even decided we were going to read the book to begin with, is kind of odd. But, you know, then again, it's me. So then I back it up and I'm like, okay. So in chapter 24 of the Eighth Tower, Keel basically kind of gives an example of an ancient civilization who had technology, something like AI, and the people die off, but the AI lives on, and so it, trying to save itself, does this whole thing on trying to send messages to people who are still alive and gets them all running all around. That was extremely reminiscent to me of the Black Knight Satellite, and I know that's by Philip K. Dick, completely different author. To be honest, I've listened to 2 podcasts on it, giving a lot of great information. Shout out to Theories of the Third Kind. That was the best one that I've heard on the Black Knight Satellite, and I know they're really, really into it. That being said, it what he's trying to convey, and remember this is 1975, he's trying to convey something almost like the Black Knight Satellite. Because towards the end of the book, Keel gets extremely negative towards the end of the Eighth Tower. I know, Sheila, you had a big issue with just how down it was making you feel. And, I mean, Emily, I know you were just kind of racing to finish it more towards the end. But yeah, he was really negative towards the end of the book. I mean, not only in what he was saying, but like you could almost read his frustration.
Yeah.
So, okay. I finished the book. All the nonsense stopped for me. Immediately, both of you two, the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I found it really, really interesting. So we finished the book, and the Uncomfortable podcast comes out with their next episode, right? Like a day or 2 later. And it's episode 112 with Stacy Brown. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, I'm really not big into Bigfoot stuff. It's just, I believe in it, but it's just not my jam. Like, I'm not all into the study of it and everything as much as other people are. So sometimes when I see it's going to be on Bigfoot or someone who's into Bigfoot, I either skip it or I put it like on the lower end of my list. Well, Emily listens to it immediately because she is into Bigfoot. And she's like, no, you really need to listen to this. And I'm kind of like, okay. And she's like, it's kind of interesting. There's some like parallels of Bigfoot in the books. And I'm like, okay. And I just kind of smile and nod my head. I'm not going to lie, girl. I love you, but I did. Well, then Eric tells me something that someone had said about the episode. And I was like, well, that's kind of a weird take. Like, what are you talking about that would make the person comment that? Because it was kind of a comment more up my alley. And so I decided to listen to it immediately. And now I totally understand what Emily was referring to. Highly recommend that episode. It's Uncomfortable Podcast, episode 112 with Stacy Brown. And It's basically Bigfoot and the paranormal. Emily, you'll do it a lot better justice than I will.
Yeah, so Stacy himself, the way that he researches and investigates Bigfoot, he comes from a paranormal background, which I found interesting because I started off as a paranormal investigator before I even came out. Like, oh yeah, I'm a psychic and I'm also a light worker, right? And so I thought it was kind of interesting. And then on top of it, some of the things that he was saying like paralleled within, especially the Eighth Tower, because Bigfoot is brought up a lot in that book and just kind of the theories that Stacy has. I don't know if he's read the Eighth Tower or not, but I mean, he's talking about like lights occurring and sulfuric smells and how it's related. But it's not like because I guess he originally started off in the camp that Bigfoot is a great ape species that hasn't been discovered yet. And then kind of after he started doing the paranormal stuff and about 6 months into his research, he was like, no, this is more paranormal. This isn't quite like a physical being. He exists. I don't know if he used the term super spectrum, but we'll use that term here because it ties into the Eighth Tower. And yeah, so I just thought it was kind of interesting. Like I was like, and so I hadn't finished the book yet because I was for the longest time stuck on page 123, and then after that I could only read about 10 pages at a time because I would get so tired. And you guys were like, you got to really finish it, and I was like, okay, fine. So I had read, like another 20 pages or so, and then the Uncomfortable episode came out, and it reflected those exact pages that I had read like literally the night before, and yeah, so I thought it was really cool.
The other thing that I found interesting, and like I said, cryptid and Bigfoot stuff is not normally my go-to, but in a lot of cryptid experiences, there's this car door slam that people hear before it presents. And in Keel's books, there's a lot of mention about people hearing a car door slam. And actually, when Indrid Cold shows up on the freeway, it sounded like a car door slamming, like a heavy car door slamming. So, very strange. The correlation between all of it was just kind of interesting.
I heard car door slamming when I was reading the book, because remember I sent you guys a message and I was like,
that's right.
I joked about it. I was like, not me hearing car door slamming while I'm reading this book and just being like, shrugging my shoulders.
I'm not
even going to investigate it because I know when I'm hearing it just because I'm reading the book, but it was funny. I think that was the weirdest thing other than the whooshing sound that happened while I was actually reading the book.
I hear car doors slam all the time, but I also live in a place that, a lot of people, my neighborhood echoes, so it makes sense. But, I'm putting together, okay, so way back in the 60s and 70s, people are hearing car doors slamming when they're seeing these entities. And these are even like the UFO orb alien entities, as well as Bigfoot is talked a lot about in the Mothman Prophecies. There are a lot of references to him in both books, actually. But then I started putting it together. Okay, so we got this sulfur smell. We've got the car door slamming. You have vibratory sounds that people can't necessarily explain, as well as physical things happening to people. Yeah, there's a little bit of loss of time, but that's not all as important as some of the other feelings of fear or being taken over. It's really, really fascinating. So one other thing that was interesting was in the Uncomfortable episode with Stacy Brown, the veil got brought up more than a few times. And the veil also, I've been talking about it for, 6 months now. And in this book, it talks about it. So in the Eighth Tower, there's a little excerpt I want to read. And it says, "Where does our reality end and the super reality of the super spectrum begin? The two seem to be so intermixed that separation is impossible, and as we plummet headlong into the Aquarian age, it's becoming more and more difficult to discern any separation point. In other ages, the two space-time continuums overlapped and produced times of magic and religious miracles. Man's earliest myths seem to be describing a time of mixed realities. So this goes into, I've been talking about the veil is open. I've been talking about what that means. I've been talking about the repercussions, how to spiritually protect yourself, being that the veil is so thin it's almost non-existent. But something that I really haven't discussed, because I'm trying not to freak people out, but the veil closing and opening is cyclical. And I don't mean that in just an every year, every 6 months type of thing. In a larger pattern, this happens. And honestly, within the Hindus, there's the Vedas. And the Vedas are these different time allotments. And currently we are in the time of screaming and yelling, which is why if you look out in the world what's happening, there is so much screaming and yelling that's occurring. And it's in order to drudge up all of these things we haven't taken care of as a civilization in order to start healing them and figuring them out. Because the next Veda that's coming up, and it's coming pretty soon, is the time when the gods live with us on this planet. And when he says in there, layered realities, that's what I've been saying. And I've been saying that actually before I even knew this book existed. Because the Eighth Tower was not on our original list to read. It just kind of happened. Right now, with the veil being so thin and almost non-existent, we are seeing and hearing other realities. And if you think of it, they're layered. We're all coexisting. We just don't see or understand that they're there. Sometimes they don't even see or understand we're here. Once in a while we get a little glimpse of each other and we're like, oh, hello, or what was that? But, these are happening on a more consistent basis as a result of this being so open, which is why I'm so dogmatic about protecting yourself, triple checking, making sure that you're in a good physical and mental space so that you can get through this time, which is going to be a bumpy ride, because not everyone is going to understand what's happening and take it with grace. I mean, if we have people who are talking about if aliens come, they want to bring out their AKs, no, we have a long way to go. So that being said, Book 2, The Eighth Tower, although we all had a really hard time getting through it, it is chock full of information. And if you have any spiritual proclivity whatsoever, or you'd like to understand scientifically how some of this stuff works, even though it was written in 75, a lot of the stuff still holds true. And it is important to take heed and take stock of what's happening around you. And listen, weird stuff happens to me all the time, okay? Like, I'm used to it at this point. It's my life. But that being said, if it happens multiple times to me, that's when I raise my eyebrow and it gets my attention. If it's a one-off thing, okay, maybe it's weird. Like, okay, and let it go. I don't get all hyped up over stuff that's a one-off. It's when it keeps repeating. And that's usually Spirit's way of tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey, I really need you to focus and take stock. Heal, look at this, giving you a heads up, whatever it may be. So that's my message, ladies. Please throw in your 2 cents.
Yeah, so the only thing that I would add is, while The Eighth Tower is a phenomenal book to look scientifically at why psychics are able to pick up on things that, most everyone else really doesn't get that much of a glimpse of, there's also parts of the book, and mainly the end, where you know, like, you just have to critically think about what you're reading. Because, yes, it starts off strong, it's very scientific, but the ending of it, I don't know what it is and why he changed, like, the way that he was writing it, but it was extremely difficult for me to read because, like, it's like one of those things, like, I could not sit there and, like, I just don't believe in what he's saying. And I'm not saying, like, you have to believe everything that you read. You know, hopefully you think about things, but it's just kind of a warning. Like, don't, just because we're saying The Eighth Tower is a great book to read, and get information on, just kind of think about what resonates with you and what's true to you, because the ending is just so doomsday like, and it's kind of scary, and I just kind of want to throw that as a warning out there.
You know, and to speak to that, in understanding where he was coming from at that time, being that I went through just a smidgen. I mean, you know, his was over a year and a half, right? Or something like that. I went through it for just a couple weeks. I could understand someone not having my background, not being grounded, not having the ability to speak on it publicly without being shamed, right? Like we can now. In that time period, plus being a man who really probably wasn't into any of this stuff and then just got taken over by it, I could understand that that could lead you to a very negative place and almost feel like, you know, when can I get off of the crazy train? But that being said, that's again why I keep talking about the veil being open and why it's important to understand the ramifications of that. Be careful what you consume. And that being said, I'm not saying, you know, don't listen or watch anything that's negative. We read these books, but we did it knowing in advance that some of this stuff we were going to be rejecting because it did not serve us or our highest good.
So, yeah, the weird thing for me was I think I struggled so hard, especially for like the end of the book, was because I was sitting there and my head kind of got jumbled up or in a mess, or the headspace just got weird just because he was touching some ideas that I just was like, I don't even want to entertain this possibility. It got kind of like heavy and kind of dark and doom and gloom, and I was just like, it just doesn't make sense to me. And so at the end, I think I struggled so hard just because I was just rejecting it. Like, I just felt like I was rejecting it. And, like, that was even, like, the end of the first book. I got, it was funny. I had a pretty, like, big reaction. Like, I was so angry when I ended, like, when I finished reading the first book, that I was just like, I don't understand, like, what was the purpose of all that? Like, all the entities being there and doing all that, and then why would they just disappear after the bridge collapsing? Like, they were trying to be helpful. Why weren't they being helpful with that situation? And I just remember just being really confused when it kind of just like, okay, we're going to go into all the details of the bridge collapsing, and then we're not going to have any explanation, which understandably, because they disappeared, right? Or nobody knows why. It's just weird that it all went hand in hand. But the fact that it was like a whole year lead up to it, that was weird. And
it was, and I know there's been a lot of different things that have come out since, you know, in regards to it, but, you know, different conspiracy theories and things like that. But all in all, you know, I found it informative. I found it interesting. But, you know, like I said, strap in for Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. So there's something that we discovered in the Eighth Tower. And we don't know if it's just bad editing. I mean, I'm not shaming the editor, but it could be just simple bad editing, or was it a hidden message? So we went through and we literally highlighted and called out all of these words that were wrong. So for instance, there was one where they wrote the word hider, but it should have been the word Hitler. Then there was one where they wrote the word stones, and yet it should have been the word stories. Another where they put the word willing, and it should have been whiling. And then another where they put dearth instead of death. Another where they put B-E-N, Ben, instead of B-H-M, which is just kind of funny. And then another one where they put Mrs. instead of Mr. So when you put them all together, like we did, and like I said, this could be a nothing burger, but we just thought it was interesting because here we go with the stones again. Hider, Stones, Willing, Dearth, Ben, Mrs. Kind of interesting. If you don't know what the word dearth means, it means scarcity or lack of evidence. So again, I keep having this weird thing with the 7 stones pop up. I eventually will get to the point where I will go and talk deeper about that in more detail. That is Mr. Toad's Wild Ride that I am trying to ignore at the current time. But Hider, Stones, Willing, Dearth, Ben, Mrs. Fascinating. Anyway, thank you all for joining us on this delightful, lovely ride. I really appreciate Emily and Sheila being with me today recording. It's so much easier to record when people are with me. But also just for reading the books with me and both of you being so willing to go on this crazy journey that we took together. But I love you all and I appreciate it. Thank you so much.